Well, the Pentagon has reportedly prepared a plan to respond to an attack from Iran. The New York Times says Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan discussed the plan with President Trump last week. It calls for the U.S. to send as many as 120,000 troops to the region if Iran attacked American forces or continued its work on nuclear weapons. Earlier today, the president denied the U.S. is currently planning to send troops.
I think it's fake news, okay? Now, would I do that? Absolutely. But we have not planned for that. Hopefully, we're not going to have to plan for that. And if we did that, we'd send a hell of a lot more troops than that.
Well, the increased tension comes as the U.S. investigates a sabotage of 4 oil tankers off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. The Pentagon's early assessment suggests Iran or Iranian proxies damaged the ships. I want to bring in David Martin and Behnam Taleblu. David is, of course, CBS News national security correspondent, and Behnam is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. So, David, we heard the president downplay the reports about sending troops and starting a war, but I want to play a quick bite just from a short time ago from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo responding to that question.
We're looking for Iran to behave like a normal country. And that's our ask, and we have applied pressure to the leadership of the Islamic Republic of Iran to achieve that. We fundamentally do not seek a war with Iran. The movement of troops that you described, I'll leave to the Department of Defense, but we've also made clear to the Iranians that if American interests are attacked, we will most certainly respond in an appropriate fashion.
David, how concerned is the Pentagon about the prospects of some sort of a conflict there?
Well, the Pentagon is very concerned about the prospect that Iranian forces or Iranian-backed forces will carry out terrorist attacks against U.S. forces or U.S. installations in Iraq, in Syria, or in the Persian Gulf. And the Pentagon, as people here have said, and as the Secretary of State has said, the Pentagon will retaliate against Iran if there is an attack against U.S. forces or U.S. interests in the region. So with Iran still actively, apparently according to the intelligence, still actively plotting to carry out attacks against Americans and this threat of American retaliation, you'd have to say the chances of some sort of conflict are increasing. And now, over the weekend, we had this incident or incidents in which 4 tankers were struck by some kind of explosive charge, and U.S. experts have been aboard those ships and inspected them, and they believe now that it is highly likely that those attacks were carried out either by Iran or by someone working on Iran's behalf. So you'd have to say that certainly in the short term, the chances of some sort of military action between Iran and the U.S. is increasing. And I think you could also say that in the long run, because basically the U.S. is using sanctions to conduct what amounts to an economic war against Iran, trying to reduce its oil exports to zero, for instance. And Iran has to make a fundamental decision of whether it's going to knuckle under to the economic pressure or whether it's going to fight back. And the Iranian regime has been in power now for 4 decades, and there's very little in its history to suggest that it will knuckle under.
Yeah. Behnam, I want to ask you, to David's point there, we know about the significant economic and military pressure that's been put on Iran, but is that enough, to David's point? 4 decades. I mean, are they just going to wait it out? Is that the strategy that'll work for them now?
Rena, David, great to be with you. You know, in the first year of the administration's max pressure campaign, you could say Iran's response was max patience, try to wait out the sanctions pressure, see if they can tolerate this economic campaign against the regime. But the regime is now signaling that it, too, has escalation options. So year 2 of max pressure, which commenced on May 8th, 2019, of course, is when Iran showing that it has options. It's laid out 2 60-day timetables to escalate its nuclear program and incrementally leave the JCPOA nuclear deal. That's a threat. It's weaving like the sword of Damocles over the heads of the leaders in the West currently. And on the regional file, Iran's strategy remains very much the same. use proxies, engage in actions that are basically heightening deniability, overcoming conventional military weaknesses, and dampening the prospects of actually trying to hold Iran accountable. All of this, of course, comes as the Pentagon is actually issuing a course correction, in my view. If you look at our carrier presence in the region last year, there was an 8 to 8.5 month period where we had 0 carriers in the Persian Gulf. And the deployment of missile defenses is also a course correction, in my view, because the U.S. stripped 4 Patriot ballistic missile defense batteries from the Persian Gulf for another theater of conflict. So I don't necessarily see the U.S. escalating here. I see the U.S. underwriting its existing deterrent posture against Iran. And this posture is designed to get Iran to realize that there is no way out but through, that the few times that the regime in Tehran has actually issued a course correction has come under severe economic and political strain. And the Iran-Iraq war remains a fundamental case study in that, because the regime in Tehran, the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, said, war, war, war until victory for 7.5 years. And at the end of the eighth year of the war, he said that he accepts the UN ceasefire resolution and likened to accepting it as to drinking from a poisoned chalice. So the whole goal of U.S. foreign policy here has to be to get Khomeini's successor, to make the same conclusion, that there is no way out but through.
David, I want to go back, though, to the oil tanker as well, as we were discussing earlier. The head of Iran's National Security Foreign Policy Committee said that the country was not behind the sabotage of the ships. Has the U.S. provided any evidence, any concrete evidence that this is, in fact, Iranian backing? We heard from Pompeo, and he said they're not ready to release it yet, but are you hearing anything different from the Pentagon?
Well, we haven't seen the evidence, but today I have heard a number of officials speak in very confident tones, using phrases like highly likely or absolutely clear that Iran was behind these explosions. Now, that's going to be based on forensic evidence, whatever they were able to collect at the scene of these explosions, the shape of the holes that were blown in the ships, any fragments of whatever charge blew these holes. Those have all been collected now and analyzed, and it was really within 24 hours that the American team came to the conclusion that it is highly likely. Now, the question remains, once that evidence is made public, and it will have to be made public if the U.S. Is going to use it to justify any kind of military action, once that evidence is made public, will it be convincing to other countries, or will the U.S. be going it alone?
Yeah. Speaking of other countries, Behnam, today Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met with Russia's Vladimir Putin and also with Sergei Lavrov. Is Russia on the same page as the U.S. with Iran? As David talked about, convincing other countries of the intelligence. Is it enough? Are they coordinated on Iran?
Broadly speaking, no. The great powers that exist, besides the United States, of course, in the P5+1, that's the collection of nations that helped actually get the JCPOA nuclear deal in 2015. The great powers, China and Russia, have long used Iran as a pawn in their broader chess game of strategic competition with the West. They've aided Iran's nuclear program, Iran's missile program, helped Iran offset sanctions pressure before. They're key components of Iran's foreign and security policy that owe their longevity and their buoyancy to Russian and Chinese technology and foreign policy designs. So these two countries have long used Iran against the West. But if the Secretary and the administration is serious, of course, about continuing to pursue a diplomatic option with Iran, the target need not be Russia or China. The target remains the European Union. Because if Iran does broadly escalate its commitments beyond the boundary of the nuclear deal, then it would be in a material breach of the deal. And it would be up to the Europeans, as advocates of the Americans and as defenders of the deal in their own right, to collapse the deal and resurrect UN sanctions and join Washington in a united Western pressure policy against Iran. Because if Iran transgresses the deal, any member of the P5+1 can actually collapse the deal and bring back UN sanctions. And that's what Washington should push for when it meets with European officials, as Secretary Pompeo did one day before traveling to the Russian Federation.
All right, no matter what, the next 2 months will be crucial here with the situation in Iran. We'll be watching. David Martin, Behnam Taleblu, thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.